All right, I think we're gonna get started. If everyone wants to get themselves settled. All right, good. All right, well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Lisa Freeman, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you here today to celebrate our newest distinguished professor in LAS, Professor Daniel Borzutzky. Established in 2006, the LAS Distinguished Professor Award recognizes faculty for their significant and sustained intellectual scholarship in their chosen fields and for their contributions to the LAS and UIC communities. Each year, the LAS Executive Committee selects award recipients from candidates in the humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, and interdisciplinary fields. The LAS community then comes together to learn about the distinguished professors' research and to toast their colleagues' accomplishments at their inaugural lecture. Today, the college is proud to celebrate the achievements of Daniel Borzutzky, professor in the departments of English and Latin American and Latino Studies at UIC. The Distinguished Professor honor recognizes the excellence of a faculty member's entire scholarly and professional profile, and in every regard, Professor Borzutzky exemplifies the standards for this prestigious award. His accomplishments as a poet, translator, mentor, institutional builder, and scholar distinguish him for this honor. Professor Borzutzky earned a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Pittsburgh in 1997 and a Master of Fine Arts in Writing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2000. He was a tenured professor at Wilbur Wright College from 2004 to 2017, including a 5-year stint as a department chair, as well as an instructor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago from 2012 to 2018. He joined UIC's faculty as an assistant professor in 2018 in the departments of English and Latin American and Latino Studies, and was promoted to professor in 2025. He was a visiting assistant professor in the Iowa Writers' Workshop in spring 2021, and in fall 2022, he founded and continues to serve as a director of the Center for Latinx Literatures of the Americas here at UIC. Since March 2024, he has served as the co-PI of the Mellon Foundation Crossing Latinidades program. He was also the artistic director of the Lit and Luz Festival, a collaborative event that brings together writers and artists from Chicago and Mexico. Professor Borzutzky has been recognized many times for his poetry and translation, including with a Penheim Translation Fund grant, a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, a National Book Award for Poetry, a National Translation Award for Poetry, and several Illinois Arts Council awards, among others. And that's a lot. He has been a finalist for the Penn Award for Poetry and Translation, the Housatonic Book Award, the Griffin International Poetry Prize, and the Chicago Review of Books Cherby Award, to name a few. Colleagues and peers across the writing community consistently note both the high level of productivity and the superlative quality of his work as a poet and translator. As these awards and honors attest, Professor Borzutzky is not only a well-regarded, but a formidably prolific writer with 10 books, 4 chapbooks, and 9 books of translation from Spanish into English to his name. His poems and translations have appeared many times in prestigious publications, including Agni, Fence, New England Review, Poetry Daily, and the Yale Review. He has published many articles in venues ranging from the New York Times to the American Poetry Review to Bomb magazine. He has given 30 interviews in print and audio formats and has translated the work of some of the most important living Chilean poets, including Raul Zurita, Paula Elabaca Núñez, and Cecilia Vicuña. Reviewing his astonishing work, his nominator notes, it is in no way an exaggeration to say that Professor Borzutzky has established himself as one amongst the most important living poets working in English. And I'll add in Spanish. As that review of his vita suggests, Professor Borzutzky's accomplishments have been numerous and far-reaching. In the words of his nominator, quote, Professor Borzutzky has not only established himself as a central and galvanizing figure in Chicago, in Latinx literatures of the Americas, in translation and translation studies, and the adjacent field of transnational literary study, he has become, too, one of the most important poets writing in English anywhere in the world. He has as large a part in the shaping of the future of the medium as any living writer, unquote. His breadth of work and the, quote, dazzlingly prodigious achievement of that work is why he is being honored today with the Distinguished Professor Award. Professor Borzutzky is also a gifted and in-demand speaker, mentor, and teacher, not only of poetry and creative writing, but of Latinx literature and literary studies more generally. In addition to his recent visiting professorship at one of the premier MFA programs in the country, he has been invited to give readings or be a visiting writer at a wide range of places, including UC Berkeley, Princeton, Harvard, the Poetry Foundation, the Poetry Project, and the Chicago Public Library, not to mention universities, bookstores, and societies across the country and the world. And I can barely keep up with Daniel. Look at his CV, and I'm like, oh, do you sleep? He has given several invited talks and keynotes, including most recently at the American Literary Translators Association, the Modern Language Association, and the International Conference on Lyric Theory and Comparative Poetics at the University of Salamanca in Spain. He has served as a judge on dozens of literary awards and has also served as an editor to Kenning Editions, Make Magazine, and Mandorla. He has also organized and shepherded other writers to UIC, including 4 high-profile Latinx writers, for an ongoing visiting writer series in English and Latin American and Latino studies. His nominator notes that Professor Borzutzky is an especially galvanizing presence in the classroom, a teacher whose enthusiasm for his students and expertise in his subject matter makes him a hugely popular instructor. Indeed, undergraduates regularly speak with excitement about his courses and workshops, and he chairs 5 dissertation committees and sits on 2 others, not to mention the many preliminary exams and MA theses committees he serves on. Even more, as his nominator attests, Professor Borzutzky goes to admirable lengths to secure opportunities for his students, whether through public readings, publication venues, or award announcements, and indeed has, on several occasions, cheered a student toward completion of the dissertation and then organized a packed bookstore reading as the defense, which I think is kind of remarkable. This dedication to his students is reflected in and amplified by the labor that Professor Borzutzky has put into the Center for Latinx Literatures of the Americas, which has since its founding in 2022 hosted 36 events, including co-sponsoring the Lit and Loose Festival mentioned earlier and running 2 sessions of the Latinx Literature Now conference through the Institute for the Humanities, all of which bring to campus dozens of the most prominent, most dynamic, and most important Latinx writers from around the country and the world. I take pride for LAS in this particular aspect of Professor Borzutzky's accomplishments and ongoing activities, as the center was something he and I dreamed up together when I was head of the English department. In just over 3 years, Professor Borzutzky has worked with colleagues to host, as I just said, more than 60 separate events. Again, I can't keep up, both here on campus and across the city of Chicago. This is what I meant when I characterized Professor Borzutzky not just as an outstanding poet and member of our faculty, but as an institutional builder. The Center for Latinx Literatures of the Americas is an astonishing boon for UIC, and that is the direct result of Professor Borzutzky's work. I cannot wait to see what the center will bring to pass in the years to come in growing its reputation and the profile of UIC under Professor Borzutzky's extraordinary leadership. In addition to his work with the center, Professor Borzutzky, as mentioned earlier, has also stepped up his involvement with the Crossing Latinidades initiative as the co-PI. This Mellon Foundation-funded initiative not only brings UIC humanities students to other Hispanic-serving institutions across the country in similar departments, but also gets UIC students into the thriving cultural and art scenes in Chicago. To once again quote his nominator, since his arrival, Professor Borzutzky has made the study of Latinx literature a considerably more visible and habitable prospect for UIC students, has brought UIC students and faculty into the thriving life of Chicago, and has made UIC itself a leading venue for work in Latin American and Latinx literature in all its dynamism and unruly breadth. It is invaluable work. In preparing for this event today, I spent some time rereading Professor Borzutzky's most recent collection of poetry, The Murmuring Grief of the Americas, and I was reminded yet again of the astonishing experience it is to enter into and yield to the demands of his work. Professor Borzutzky writes about the hollowing out of the human condition amid the inexorable ravages of late-stage capitalism. With insistent precision, he captures through sound and rhythm the harsh and unrelenting cadence of economic and social inequity visited upon bodies, in many cases in this collection, the bodies of so-called essential workers amid the COVID pandemic. How does a human experience being classified at one and the same time both as essential and as unfortunate but necessary collateral damage, as waste, with nowhere to turn and no other options, as someone whose own essential human needs are not indeed considered essential at all? Professor Borzutzky doesn't allow us the usual poetic turn or epiphany that offers some distance or consolation from that experience. Instead, he insists that we confront it head on, that we immerse ourselves in the reality of what it means, for instance, in day number 429, it's one of the poems, to say, I need $5 for lunch, I need bus fare, I need money for rent, I need to not be where I am. Professor Borzutzky will share more from and about his writing and his practice later today, but as I hope this brief overview of his many accomplishments demonstrates, he is in the midst of an astonishing career. Indeed, as his nominator notes, Professor Borzutzky is a writer coming fully into his own. It is for his many academic and professional achievements and his dedication as a scholar, teacher, and mentor that we are delighted to bestow upon him the LAS Distinguished Professor honor today. It is now my great pleasure to invite Professor Borzutzky to come forward to receive his Distinguished Professor medallion. Here for now. Now, please join me in welcoming our esteemed colleague and the college's newest liberal arts and sciences distinguished professor, Daniel Borzutzky, to give his inaugural lecture entitled How They Wrote Certain of My Books, The Infinite Catastrophes of Translation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa. As somebody who is not good at receiving attention, I feel both extremely honored. I feel extremely honored to have received such a generous introduction and to be receiving this distinction, especially among so many other incredible people who I get to work with every day. I want to in particular thank the chairs of English and LALS, Pete Coviello and Jonathan Inda, and all of the colleagues in those departments who have helped to make them incredible places to work. I want to begin just by acknowledging the obvious that today's talk is happening amid kind of dual attacks on universities, on the humanities, on cultural institutions, and on the imagination kind of writ large, all of which are things that might help us to survive this very moment. And I also want to acknowledge some of the recent writing that some of my colleagues like Pete Coviello and Anna Kornblue have done to defend the humanities and the universities and the very acts of consuming culture in our society. At the same time as those attacks on the university are happening, we are, of course, under ICE occupation, and many of us are extremely concerned about ourselves, our family members, our friends, our neighbors who we are witnessing being abducted. So in particular, I know that LALS, in LALS, we straddle both of those things. The people in LALS are affected by both of those things, attacks on the university and attacks on migrants at the same time. I'm really grateful to people for coming out today amid this situation, and especially to all the students in the room who I know are feeling all of those things and for whom this is a really scary time. So I will begin. Just begin with a quick shout out. I'm not going to discuss Raymond Roussel, only to say I stole the title of my talk from his 1935 book, How I Wrote Certain of My Books. Roussel, a neighbor of Marcel Proust, influencer of the Surrealists, the Oulipo, the New York School, and many others. I'm not going to discuss it, but go check it out if you are interested. Okay, I'm going to start. This is going to take like 45 minutes, so it will end. For the translator-poet, translation is not just merely a side gig or a supplement. Rather, I'd say it's both a compositional method and an epistemology, a way of making and a way of being. My work as a writer and my work as a translator have developed simultaneously, and they have informed each other and sustained each other. I learned how to write by translating, and I learned how to translate by writing. And I should say that the talk is going to kind of discuss my writing over the last 10 years or so. So to begin, I'll talk about a few important frameworks that have helped me think about this practice. Olivia Lott, an assistant professor in Spanish at Yale, has an essay forthcoming in comparative literature about my work called Translation and the Continuum of Decomposition, Daniel Borzutzky's translation-based hemispheric poetics. In that essay, Lott uses the term translation-based poetics to discuss my work. I've discussed this with her. I really like that phrasing. And in this essay, she designates 3 modes of translation-based poetics, which go beyond traditional conceptions of translation. 1, how the text positions translation as fundamental poetic theory. 2, how translation surfaces in intratextual features not conventionally treated as translation, such as repetition, inferentiality, and equivalencies. And 3, how intertextual translation manifests to extend the project in relation to ideas of transposition, mapping, and untranslatability. I think her intervention is really exciting. It's really smart writing about my own work, which is an honor to have, but it's also a really kind of interesting intervention in translation studies to push it to think about kind of non-typical translation material as valid. Another important idea comes from poet and translator Don-Mi Che, and in particular, Don-Mi's 2014 pamphlet, Freely Frayed, Race Equals Nation, where she discusses her work translating the great Korean poet Kim Hye-soon. And she says, quote, "My translational intent has nothing to do with personal growth, intellectual exercise, or cultural exchange, which implies an equal standing. South Korea and the US are not equal. I am not transnationally equal. My intent is to expose what a neo-colony is, what it does to its own, what it eats and shits." Kim Hye-soon's poetry reveals this, and this is why I translate her work. To this, I'd add that in translating Chilean poets, I've had the opportunity to understand and to indeed translate not just the effects of US empire on Latin America, but in fact, it's allowed me a way to understand my own life in the US. And a final idea comes from some writing and thinking I published about 10 years ago about the connections between Chicago and Chile in this essay called Are We Latino? Memories of My Overdevelopment. And I wrote, quote, "We tend to think about global influences moving from the US outwards. In other words, the stereotypical position is that the US affects the policies of the rest of the world and not the other way around, but I can't help but see this differently. After all, I'm a falso Chileno living in Chicago, a Latin American city that has re-imported its extreme neoliberalism from Chile, the testing ground for the privatization shock treatments dreamed up by the economists, the so-called Chicago boys at the University of Chicago, which are now being reenacted Chilean style in Chicago. Witness the recent simultaneous Chilean and Chicagoan strikes with privatization at their cores as proof of our shared vulgarities. That must have been 2012. As I look back on this writing from over 10 years ago, what I was trying to figure out was an answer to the question of what it meant to be writing in a moment when the co-joined forces of racialized policing and state and economic violence were ravishing my city. sentence that could be equally true of today in a different context. 2012 in Chicago witnessed education strikes and the privatization of public education via Mayor Rahm Emanuel's decision to close 50 neighborhood public schools. At the same time, education strikes were happening in Chile that were also centered around the privatization of education and the way in which families were going into debt to pay not just for university education, but for elementary and high school as well. State disappearance was also present in Chicago via the prison at Homan Square, a so-called black site where mostly black Chicagoans were taken to without being registered. Cases of torture and even death were alleged to have occurred there. In other words, I was trying to figure out a language in which to depict these realities, and translation of Chilean poets was key to helping me frame my thinking as I'd become convinced about the ways in which the Chicago Boys' economic policies tested out during the Pinochet dictatorship were coming back to Chicago via anti-public sector policies enforced by brutal state violence. So I'm going to read a poem I wrote around that time period, probably around 2014, which, while highlighting migration, also exemplifies the translation-based techniques that have been foundational for my work. I'm going to read this alongside of the second episode from the very first season of Speedy Gonzales in 1955, which, as you'll see, has an immigration, politics, and imaginary that will seem quite contemporary. A word about the handouts. There is a version of this poem on the page that I'll talk about. It is slightly different from the version I'm going to read, but I thought it'd be helpful for people to have text in front of them as well. And so can we get the lights, please? Thank you. Sorry if the volume is really loud, I'm not sure. On the side of the border, 1,000 refugees stand in the desert under a sun that can only be described as blazing. A starving one points to the line the refugees are peering over and says, "That's where the country begins." This is a story about protecting the nation from foreign invasions. The refugees were processed through Arizona or California before they were sent back across the border. Their bodies were betrayed by country A in exchange for some valuable resource needed by country B. The wetbacks huddled in a circle under an enormous cactus to draw straws to see who would go for the cheese. Manuel, he win. He got the short straw. He's a lucky fellow. He gives his hat to his buddies. They'll hold it for him as he takes one for the team, as he takes one for the whole bloody nation. But he's a slow little fucker, a spicy little treat for the border patrol to devour as he protects the homeland from parasites. Do you remember, fellas, when we had that one piece of cheese? How nice it was to take turns passing the cheese back and forth between our mouths. We licked each other's slobber off the dirty cheese that had been in who knows how many of our mouths. He wants to know what color the cheese was, what it was made of, how many mouths had licked it. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. Arresting a starving refugee, the Border Patrol says, "I have seen that sombrero before." I am moving through the desert and not sleeping and trying to cross the border from one sick part of the world to another. But where is the light, and why does it not come in through your starving fingers? You hold your starving fingers before my eyes, and there is light in them, but I cannot see them. You say, there are countries in my starving fingers. I am interested in the borders, or I am interested in the gas chambers in your collapsible little fingers. You put them to my face and I see your hands open, and in them I see a thick wall and a sky and an ocean, and 10 years pass and it's still nighttime and I'm falling and there are bodies on the ground in your bloody hands. The broken bodies stand by the border and wait for the radiation to trickle out of the factories and into their skin. They hide in the cheese bowl, and they know the eyes that watch them own their bodies. A more generous interpretation might be that their bodies are shared between the earth, the state, and the bank. The sentences are collapsing one by one, and the bodies are collapsing in your bloody hands, and you stitch me up and pray I will sleep, and you tell me of the shattered bus stops where the refugees are waiting for the buses to take them to the mall where they are holding us now, and there is a man outside our bodies making comments about perspective and scale and light, and there is light once more in your bloody fingers. All I see is the desert and the little refugees falling into it. Again, that's like the most boring image ever. The desert is frozen and they are dying behind the fence watching the guards patrolling the cheese, and you tell me they might fall and break open and that humans and countries will fall out of them, and that this will be the start of the bedtime story you will tell me on this our very last night on earth. Come closer, you say with your eyes. Move your bloody face next to mine and rub me with it. We are dying from so many stories. We are not complete in the mind from so many stories of burning houses, missing children, slaughtered animals. Who will put the stories back together again, and who will restore the bodies? The stories, they are there, but we need a bit more wit. We need something lighter to get us to the end of the story. Did you hear the one about the guy who picked up chicks by quoting the oral testimonies of the illiterate villagers who watched their brothers and sisters get slaughtered? Or, andale, andale, arriba, arriba, welcome to Tijuana. You cannot eat any more barbecued iguana. It was 1987, and my friends from junior high trapped me on the floor and mashed bananas in my face and sang, "It's no fun being an illegal alien." The putty cat guards the Ajax cheese factory behind the fence, right across the border. The wetback mice see the gringo cheese. They smell the gringo cheese. Your gringo cheese, it smells so good. They need Speedy Gonzalez to get them some ripe, fresh, stinky cheese, gringo cheese. Do you know the Speedy Gonzalez? Asks one of the starving wetback mice. I know him. Speedy Gonzalez friends with my sister. The mice laugh. Speedy Gonzalez friends with everybody's sister. Ha! The little border crossing sneak fucking mouses think it's cute that they're invading our culture to steal our cheese, but it don't make a difference because you and I, we are taking a stroll on the electrified fence of love because I feel a little Southern Californian transnational romance coming on right about now. I feel like Daniel from The Karate Kid because I too once had a Southern Californian experience where I wasn't aware that I was learning ancient Japanese secrets when I was waxing on and waxing off. And I am with you, Mr. Miyagi, in Reseda. I am with you, Mr. Miyagi, in Pasadena. And I am with you, Mr. Miyagi, at the All Valley Karate Tournament. And I am with you, Mr. Miyagi, in Okinawa, where you went in Karate Kid 2 to meet your long-lost girlfriend when you discovered that she wasn't married off when she was just a teenager to your fiercest Okinawan rival. And I am with you, Mr. Miyagi, in Tijuana, where it's murder and diarrhea and always kind of kinky. But seriously, friends, what do you make of this darkness that surrounds us? They chopped up 24 bodies last night, and today I have to pick up my dry cleaning. So for now, hasta luego, compadres, and don't worry too much about the bucket of murmuring shit that is the United Statesian night. What does it say? What does it say? What do you want it to say? Thank you. Just for fun. Things you can get on Amazon. So I handed out a slightly different version of the poem with comments on it from my 2016 book, The Performance of Becoming Human, which for me helps me to explain the kind of intertextual and translational work that I was doing at the time. If this writing is my own, then I would insist that it's only my own because it's in dialogue with so many different texts, from Speedy Gonzalez to Kafka, to the Karate Kid 2, to the Mexican Institutes of Sound's song Karate Kid 2, which literally narrates the plot of Karate Kid 2 in a kind of poppy dance hit, to Allen Ginsberg's Howl, to Robert Creeley, to Horacio Castellanos Moya, to the rock band Genesis' 1983 song Illegal Alien. On one level, the poem was deeply interested in early pop culture references to Mexicans and migration. And at the same time, I think this is a good example of what Olivia Lott means by saying my work is translation-based, that it would not exist without the dialogue it's forming with such a vast range of work. Ironically, the only time I've ever been accused of plagiarizing was with this poem. A poet known for his cantankerousness sent me an email one night telling me that I'd plagiarized him. The next morning, though, he did write back to say that he had had too much to drink at his department party and retracted the accusation. Poets. Nevertheless, more things to buy on Amazon. Translation and the continuum of decomposition by way of introduction to the idea that translation is a thing that decides when it is to be done. But since it's never done, we're always repositioning ourselves as subjects in the world we imagine and the worlds we occupy. And since we can't really tell the difference between those worlds, we engage in translation as a primal act that comes before everything else. Which is to say that because we cannot scream, we translate. Because we do not know how to interpret the screams of others, we translate. Because the broken bodies and the broken nations and the broken institutions that are always breaking cannot be understood, we translate. We howl and we shriek and we translate. Anne Carson, in Variations on the Right to Remain Silent, argues that catastrophe provides a, quote, genius answer for refusing clarity. The context for this is the trial of Joan of Arc in 1431, whose historical record, Carson says, is, quote, fraught with translation at every level. Per Carson, Joan was illiterate. She spoke Middle French that was translated into Latin by the judges, and her words were often mistranslated to establish an artificial basis for her guilt. What's most striking in this discussion is the question of Joan's voices. All Joan's guidance, Carson writes, military and moral, came from a source she called voices. All the blame of her trial was gathered up in this question, the nature of the voices. They spoke to her from outside, commanding her life and death, her military victories and revolutionary politics, her dress code and heretical belief, end quote. During the trial, the judges want her to name and identify the voices, which Joan adamantly refuses to do. A genius is in her rage, writes Carson. We all feel this rage at some point. The genius answer to it is catastrophe, which of course traditionally means, as we know, it means disaster, but historically meant the unraveling of a plot in a play or a kind of sudden turn. Carson puts catastrophe in opposition to cliché and also in opposition to clarity. Francis Bacon, says Carson, has another term for catastrophizing, quote, destroying clarity with clarity. I like to think about this as a goal for translation and subsequently as a goal for art making and poetry. Say bad translation, writes Sawako Nakayasu in her manifesto, Say Translation is Art. Say F translation, say meritless, ugly, bush pig translation, say committing error in translation, violating the integrity of this language, say half-assed translation, mediocre translation, loser and suckers translation, nasty translation, bitchy translation. It's not that I'm a bad writer, a critic wrote about my book, The Performance of Becoming Human. Rather, I appear to be writing as a, quote, bad writer on purpose. I want to try to say something serious about this book review. At the time, this review of The Performance of Becoming Human in the LA Times was just about the highest profile writing about my work in the sense of the amount of readers the review would have reached. And it's also probably the worst review my work has received. I also want to say it is my favorite review of all of the reviews of my books for a few reasons. At its best, a review for the writer can help you to understand something latent in your own work in which you have not yet fully articulated about your own methods and approaches. According to the reviewer, it's not in here, it's on a different spot, my diction had been criticized by some unnamed figures as being flat and repetitive, my imagery was repellent, and my authorial tone was rejected as the unpoetic rantings of an ideologue. don't love everything about that sentence. I'm not sure I'd consider myself an ideologue, and it seems like a cheap shot to attribute her criticisms of me to some unnamed figures who apparently made these comments, not in print as far as I could tell, at the proverbial water cooler. However, I don't mind the repetitive part, and I don't mind the unpoetic part. And to return to the earlier line about me being a bad writer on purpose, the distinction she is making, the reviewer is making between good writing and bad writing, well, I'd never set out to be a bad writer on purpose, but that distinction made me realize that I'd rather be on the side of bad writing than good writing. What I think was at stake in these distinctions were questions of institutionalization, of aesthetic homogenization, and frankly, of purpose, of who and what writing is for. And she makes this sort of dismissive comment about my critique of simile and Neruda, saying poetry in defense might, where is it? Implicit in the dystopic perspective is an indictment of simile. Think of Neruda reacting to sanctioned violence in Chile. The blood of children ran in the streets like the blood of children. She's not wrong that I was critiquing simile. She is wrong that Neruda is writing about Chile. He's not actually writing about Chile. He's writing about Spain and the Spanish Civil War in 1937 and not 1973. Sort of flip the numbers around, perhaps. But nevertheless, I thought that there was something substantive in pointing that out, and thus, not long after reading the review, I wrote the following poem, which tried to amplify that critique of metaphor that the author was suggesting was in my work. In other words, I wanted to sort of do the thing that I was being criticized and do it more. The version I'm going to read is bilingual, is really meant for two voices, and it includes translations from the Mexican poet David Rojas. I'm going to read a slightly abridged version of it, but you have the whole thing in front of you. Lake Michigan, Scene 10, epigraphs. The great virtue of a free market system is that it does not care what color people are. It only cares whether they can produce something you want to buy. It is the most effective system we have discovered to enable people who hate one another to deal with one another and help one another, wrote Milton Friedman from the south side of Chicago. Neruda, y por las calles la sangre de los niños corría simplemente como sangre de niños. And through the streets, the blood of children ran simply like the blood of children. Lake Michigan, Scene 10. The police shooting boys are like police shooting boys. Y los nazis quemando judíos es como nazis quemando judíos. And the police protecting Nazis are like police protecting Nazis. Y los prisioneros que son torturados son como prisioneros que son torturados. Y los psicólogos supervisando tortura son como psicólogos supervisando tortura. And the mayor privatizing prisons is like the mayor privatizing prisons. Y los prisioneros quebrados en la playa son como prisioneros quebrados en la playa. And the broken prisoners on the beach are like broken prisoners on the beach. I dream I am pregnant and my baby is a revolutionary plan to destroy the global economy. And my baby is like a baby with a bullet in its mouth, who's like a baby with a bullet in its mouth, who's like a baby with a bullet in its mouth. Y los empleados públicos desaparecidos son como empleados públicos desaparecidos. And the hunger of an actual child is the hunger of an actual child. Y la función básica de la economía es la función básica de la economía. And the bourgeois savages are like bourgeois savages. And the bourgeois savages who do not see themselves as savages are like bourgeois savages who do not see themselves as savages. And the bodies expropriated for private purposes are like bodies expropriated for private purposes. And when they disappear into the pinhole of capital, they disappear into the abyss of capital. Y la comida desperdiciada en la playa es como comida desperdiciada en la playa. And the starving children who are not allowed to eat the wasted food on the beach are like starving children who are not allowed to eat wasted food on the beach. And the bourgeois savages do not notice the broken bodies until they are beaten in their bourgeois backyards. Y dicen, un cuerpo quebrado en mi patio no cuenta para nada, y son como la gente que piensa que un cuerpo quebrado no cuenta para nada. And a massacre at a black church is a massacre at a black church, y una masacre en una primaria es una masacre en una primaria, y los nazis con antorchas son como nazis con antorchas, y la policía que asesina es como policía que asesina, and the dying sand is like dying sand, and the refugee arrested for speaking the wrong language is a prisoner who never learns to speak the right language, y la bomba es como una bomba, y los anestéticos son como anestéticos. And the blankness of the city is like the blankness of the city. And the language of the riot is the language of the riot. Y la sangre de los silenciados es como sangre de los silenciados. And the blindness of the bourgeois savage is like a mouth that can't stop biting, a body that refuses to die. So that was from Lake Michigan in 2018. Oh no, I have the wrong version here. I'm going to take a 1-minute break, and you can watch this classic Argentinian Diet Coke commercial from, which is actually based on a poem I learned today by this writer, Rodolfo Fogwell.
Tu amor es una lágrima con sabor a miel. Tienes 2 perlas por ojos.
Se necesitan malos poetas.
Flores por piel.
Buenas personas, pero poetas malos. Se necesitan Carlos y Roberto que escriban. Gente que cante al amor adolescente, al autito que nunca lo dejó, a la Coca Light. En los bancos, en las pizzerías de los barrios y en los slippers se buscan poetas. Funcionarios, consultores, todo eso sobra. Faltan los poetas, los 1000, los 10.000 malos, cada uno con su orgullo, cada uno armado con su poemita impublicado. Se necesita para que broten nuevos sentimientos sencillos, nuevos pensamientos inútiles que hagan estallar sobre nosotros la niebla y flores del poema.
So we need bad poets, in case you didn't catch it. Good poets, but good people, but bad poets. The 10,000 bad ones, each with their pride, each one with their own little unpublishable poems, among other wonderful lines in that commercial. All right, back to. We are beings made for death because the reason each of us will die are always expressed in the most distant of languages, in an untranslatable language. These words were written by Raul Zurita to explain Garcilaso de la Vega's accounting of the decapitation of Tupac Amaru, the last of the Inca monarchs. It's Cusco, 1572. The herald is announcing the supposed offenses that have condemned Tupac Amaru to death. The prisoner hears but does not understand. He asks the friar who is walking with him to translate because he does not know the language that contains the reason for which he will die. So in the second half of this presentation, I want to tell the story of another poem and subsequently an interrelated short story. I forgot to take the poem out. There it is. The poem is called How I Wrote Certain of My Books and appeared in my 2024 collection, The Murmuring Grief of the Americas, and the short story is called The Translators, which was published in summer 2025. The origins of these two pieces is the year 2020, when I started writing a novel, which eventually ran out of steam, but which in the subsequent years turned into various poems and short stories. The novel was, one of the plot lines of the novel was about a translator searching for a writer he had once translated, a kind of cult writer, a Chilean exile who wrote under multiple names and who it turns out was publishing work that was not his own and which had been given to him as a literary favor by a distant uncle who himself was a poet and translator. There were two reference points here that were loosely informing the characters in my writing. The first is the great Chilean poet Juan Luis Martínez. I am on the wrong, there we go. So the first is Juan Luis Martínez, a truly innovative experimental writer who in his lifetime published only one book, the 1977 collection La Nueva Novela, the new novel. It's a book that's extremely hard to classify, and you can see some examples of it here. It uses found text, collage, and techniques that we might now call conceptualism. There is a translation of this book by Jack Schmidt, who, among other things, translated Pablo Neruda's Canto General, but it's never come out because the Martinez's family maintains such tight control over his works. So this is a translation of that book, a few poems from that book by the great contemporary poet Mónica de la Torre, and I'll just read a tiny little bit from Cheshire Cat. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. Imagine you're Alice and you're spending a season in Wonderland where you find a cat without a body whose head floats in space. The disembodied cat disappears at will. It displays a permanent, mysterious smile. You introduced it to the king, but the strange friend of yours is not to the king's liking, so he decides to eliminate it. The executioner does not think a beheading is possible unless there exists a body from which to cut off a head. The king claims that anything with a head can be beheaded. Redaction, find a solution, and then it goes on into this sort of redacted syllogistic form that he uses throughout that book. Scott Weintraub, a scholar of Latin American literature and professor at the University of New Hampshire, in researching Martinez, came to understand something important about the translational nature of Martinez's work. So Martinez published that one book, the new novel, and then several posthumous books emerged afterwards. There's a posthumously published collection of Martinez's, Juan Luis Martinez's, entitled Poemas del Otro, Poems for the Other. Unlike La Nueva Novela, this was a much more lyrically conventional book of poems, and it had nothing to do with Martinez's signature style. Critics didn't know how to understand it until Weintraub discovered that the Chilean Juan Luis Martinez's Poemas del Otro, Poems of the Other, was actually a translation of this book, La Silence et sa brisure, by the Swiss Catalan poet Juan Luis Martinez. So the Chilean Juan Luis Martinez published translated the Swiss Catalan poet Juan Luis Martinez, and it was published posthumously, but we can sort of pretend that he claimed it as his own. Somehow he came across his work, not entirely clear. Weintraub tracked down the Swiss Catalan Juan Luis Martinez, who was about the same age as the Chilean Juan Luis Martinez. The Swiss Juan Luis Martinez was initially upset to learn about this translation, but then came around and found it amusing, and he has since been invited to Chile to take part in conferences and seminars on the Chilean Juan Luis Martinez. In my short story, The Translator, there's a French poet-scholar named Marina Badinter who publishes poems under the pseudonym Juana Luisa Martinez as perhaps a third level of this continuation of Juan Luis Martinez's. We've had a fourth one to our campus through the Center for Latinx Literature, the Colombian-born novelist Juan Martinez, who's a professor at Northwestern. He's missing the second name, Luis, but we'll put him in the honorary Juan Luis Martinez Club. So this, you can see, is very different. This is an example of one of the poems from Poemas del Otro, which looks very different than these and kind of content-wise as well. The second reference point for the protagonist of the novel, let's say, or the cult writer who's being searched for, is a poet, essayist, and editor named Samuel Glusberg. There's a lot to say about Glusberg. The first is he is a relative of mine. His whole name is Samuel Glusberg Talesnik, and Talesnik is my mother's maiden name. Glusberg was born in 1898 in Kishinev, Moldova. A few years later, fleeing pogroms, his family moved to Argentina, where he died in Buenos Aires in 1987. As a young writer in Buenos Aires, he circulated in the world of great Argentine writers like Jorge Luis Borges and Oliviero Girondo. He made correspondences throughout the Americas with people like the Peruvian socialist theorist Juan Carlos Mariátegui, and in the US with writers like Waldo Frank. He was, to use contemporary jargon, a writer of the hemispheric Americas at a time when maintaining international context must have been extremely difficult, expensive, and hard to do. In the 50s, he moves to Chile and marries his cousin, and he lives in Chile until 1973, when the military coup sends him back to Argentina. He's a committed Trotskyite, which I think got him into trouble with some of the more traditional socialists. Nevertheless, from what I understand, he leaves Chile in 73 and returns to Argentina. He's the author of many books and collections of poems, which he published under the pseudonym Enrique Espinosa, which he took in honor of the 17th century Spanish Jewish philosopher Spinoza. Glusberg was one of the editors of an important literary journal called Babel, which, according to my mother, was often used as a doorstop in her childhood home. I've asked many Chilean poets if they know who Samuel Glusberg is, and I'm yet to meet one who has heard of him, though you can now find some scholarly articles about him, and Enrique Espinosa has a page on the cultural website Chile Memoria. The poets, however, do know about Babel, the literary journal he co-edited. And what to me this says about Glusberg is that he was one of those rare writers who was more interested in promoting the work of others than he was in promoting his own work. The only person I've met who knows about Glusberg is literary scholar Harris Feinsod, a friend to many people in this room from his time as a professor at Northwestern. Harris came across Glusberg while researching his book, Poetry of the Americas, which examined the relationships and correspondence of poets in the US and Latin America in the Cold War period. And Harris had a digital file of Glusberg's correspondences with Waldo Frank, among others. In 2017, Rachel and I were in Chile, and we visited a 94-year-old aunt, my tia Lea, who is no longer alive. And she was the cousin of my grandfather, and she had been close with Glusberg. She's probably about 25 years younger. And this visit was the very first time that I had heard of him. As no one in her immediate family had literary interests, she gave me a stack of his books, published under the name of Enrique Espinosa. He wrote in rhyming sonnets. Here's one for Waldo Frank. I showed these books to Cecilia Vicuña at one point, and she didn't know who Glusberg was either, but she pointed out to me that one of the poems was dedicated to her grandfather, Carlos Vicuña, a writer, politician, and lawyer who, among other things, had been Neruda's lawyer in the 40s when he was chased out of Chile for being a socialist. The world of the Chilean intelligentsia of those years must have been quite small and interconnected, and Cecilia and I have enjoyed the idea that our friendship was threaded together decades before by this friendship between her grandfather and my uncle. So to return to the novel that I started writing, which later becomes a poem and then later becomes a series of short stories, the disappeared Chilean poet, who is its subject, is named Samuel Glusman, named after my relative Samuel Glusberg, though he also publishes under the name Abraham Dahlberg. The translator looks for him for decades, and he eventually encounters a French scholar named Marina Badinter, aka Juana Luisa Martinez, who meets Glusman in a college town in the United States, where he's living under a different name and teaching writing workshops out of his home. As I said, the first iteration of the novel, which I wrote about 80 pages of, kind of ran out of steam, but over the next few years, it was transformed first into a 4-page poem called How I Wrote Certain of My Books, and then into a few short stories. And I will read a little bit of the poem and then the short story to take us out. How I Wrote Certain of My Books. I met the poet in a writing workshop he offered out of his home. I was one of 4 students in the class. There was one student who never spoke and never turned in any writing, and the poet loved her because the silent student understood that the ultimate form of poetry was silence, and we all saw something sublime in her refusal to acknowledge even the most basic forms of communal norms and discourse. Another student was a father of 3 kids. He owned a small business and was, quote, doing something for himself for a change. Austerity measures have forced me to abandon aesthetic or narrative unity. I work too much and I don't have time to write anymore, and it limits my creativity and coherence. I cut my budge by 25%. No, I can't even. The poet's preferred way of signing books was greetings from the land of anti-value. Like all good poets, the poet hated his own poetry. I loved his first book, but he thought all the poems were cheap imitations of René Char and Gertrude Stein. All poets should hate their own poetry, said the poet. You should never be able to look at your own poetry without feeling utterly repulsed. If you're proud of your own poetry or enjoy reading your own poetry, then you need to figure out how to write poems that will offend yourself just a little bit more robustly. The father of 3 who was doing something for himself for a change wrote epic poems about his childhood. The poet referred to the father of 3 poems as sociopathic imitations of Frank O'Hara, only more interesting. They were horror stories, frankly, and none of us knew how to respond to them. The poet loved that we didn't know how to respond to the father of three's poems. He thought the best response to a poem was to feel like, what the fuck did I just read? I don't have an idea what I just read. What did I just read? Do you understand remotely what I just read? And it appeared that the father of three met this standard of what the fuckery in his epic poem about a man, now a poet, of course, who watched his mother kill his father when he was a child. The father of three was kind and cheerful and always showed up to the workshop with wine or cookies or cake. The poet would give advice like, fuck doing new things, you're a writer, not an iPhone. You don't need a constant update. You don't need to keep changing your algorithm. The other student in the workshop was an attorney and she was about to retire. Her favorite poets were H.D. and Sylvia Plath, and she knew almost every detail of Greek and Roman mythology, which often served as tropes in her poems. She wrote poems that possessed what the poet once called, quote, a subtle hint of bureaucratic eroticism. She was terrified of retiring and was pursuing poetry because she wanted to make sure she had plenty of activities to keep her mind from atrophying in her retirement, and so she designed complex mazes of poems that were impossible to work their way out of, and the poet would ask her questions like, what does this poem hate? What does this poem love? How can you make this poem hate more lovingly and love more hatefully? I was the other student in the workshop, and I hated writing poems that looked like poems, so the poet thought I had the right attitude about poetry, even if my poems were didactic or bland or facile. The poet didn't know if being a poet meant being the best/worst version of himself or the best/worst version of someone else. The object of a poem, he used to say, is to try to put every possible thing into the poem so that the poem is not so much a poem, but a container for the entire world, and in this way there might eventually be no distinction between living and writing and art and life and art and death, and the world as we know it and the world we desire and the world we despise. United Statesians are obsessed with privacy. Is that your chocolate and my peanut butter? Every line I've ever written is a version of another line I've ever written, and sometimes I write the same lines over and over again to see if they sound different in a different context. It was the end of a long evening, and the poet was feeling generous, so he gave me a thumb drive with decades worth of unpublished writing, a memoir, a novel, 3 or 4 collections of poems, and told me to do whatever I want with them. I'm dying, frankly, and I think it would be good for your career if you put your name on some of the better poems and sent them out for publication. Now that the country is, quote, teetering on dictatorship, the poets have come to believe that the subjectivity of subjective experience has a responsibility to be as ugly as the objectivity of objective experience. Awkward sentence, bro. Time for another revision. And so to conclude, I'll read a little bit from the short story, The Translators, the sort of third iteration of novel poem to short story. And this was published this past summer in the literary journal Zizova. The poet's pen name is Samuel Glusman. According to some sources, Glusman's real last name may have been Gendelman, Friedeberg, Meyer, Espinosa, Thoma, or Bari. He was, according to one set of poems, a quiet kid. He was a master of strategy games like chess and backgammon. He fed stray cats. He discovered Cesar Vallejo when he was 16 and read Olive Trilce to his 2-year-old nephew, whom he watched after school. He had a few friends, but mostly stayed home and read books. He was gay, but never told his family out of fear they would beat him or kick him out of the house. According to another set of poems, he was born in 1952. He studied medicine for 2 years at the Universidad Católica in Santiago. He was arrested in October 73, a little more than a month after the coup. He fled the country and lived in Caracas, Mexico City, San Francisco, Paris, Stockholm, and several towns and villages in Spain and Latin America. He never finished his medical studies. He drove a cab. He worked as a park ranger, a dishwasher, and a postal worker. He worked at hotels, hardware stores, movie theaters, pharmacies, and hospitals. He sold furniture, kitchenware, shoes, stationery, insurance, and ice cream, or at least these are the lives he wrote about in a biographical poem called Memories of My Overdevelopment in his book La Noche Invisible, which he submitted to various prizes. Despite rules barring him from entering more than one contest, he sent the manuscript all over the world and won regional awards in Medellín, Extremadura, Lima, Tijuana, San Juan, El Paso, and Guayaquil. This, according to later poems, allowed him to live for the next few years without working so many jobs. So I'll jump ahead to a scene where the translator meets the French Marina Badinter, also known as Juana Luisa Martinez. It takes several weeks for Badinter to respond to the translator's email. She says she's been traveling, first to see family, then to a conference in Madrid on, quote, literature and trauma and exile and memory and other kinds of academic bullshit that are really not worth talking about. There she gave what she called an incoherent talk that labored through the poetics of Walking and Thomas Bernhard and W.G. Sebald, the films of the Argentine director Lucrecia Martel, and the photographs that American soldiers took of prisoners they tortured in Iraq. There were only 5 people in the audience to hear my sham of a paper, Badinter writes, and 2 of them were the other speakers. The conference scheduled her presentation during a reading by Javier Marias, which, quote, I would have much rather have attended than having to listen once more to my own tired and pedantic bullshit. She then goes on to tell him about a moment in Javier Marias' novel, A Heart So White, one of her favorite scenes in all of literature, where the narrator, who's an interpreter for a high-ranking British politician, begins to mistranslate a tense conversation she's having with a high-ranking Spanish politician, whose interpreter in turn plays along. The Spanish politician and the British politician asks the British politician if she would like some tea, which is translated as, quote, tell me, do the people in your country love you? The 2 translators then lead the officials through a mistranslated conversation about politicians' relationship to the citizens they represent, nationalism, democracy, and dictatorship. Surely, Badinter writes, as a translator, you, like the translators of this meeting between the high-ranking European officials, have felt the urge to completely change the text you are translating. What translator has not wanted to improve, either linguistically or conceptually, the poem they're translating? In fact, there really isn't very much wrong with this, she writes, as long as the thing that is being translated is something the writer might have said or should have said. Often, Badinter writes, when I give poetry readings, I read poems I haven't written or that I've translated. I don't tell the audience that I didn't write the poems, but I don't tell them that I did write them. The important thing is that I might have written them, that I could have written them, and who the hell cares about authorship anyway? Translation, she says, is nothing more than the creation of infinite originals. And then this is the final scene of the story where the French scholar is recounting her visit with Samuel Glusman, who is now living in a psychiatric hospital after attempting suicide. He was happy to see me, she says. He was sitting in a reclining chair staring out the window. It was hard to get him to make eye contact or to make small talk, but when he finally did begin to speak, he said several things I could barely understand. He told me about an uncle of his, Samuel Glusman, says Badinter, who was a writer, a poet who in the 1930s and 40s had been friends with Juan Emar and Vicente Huidobro and other members of the Chilean avant-garde. This uncle moved to Paris for several years, and when he came back, says Badinter, quoting Glusman, he decided he didn't want to write anymore. He'd written several books and said he was sick of poetry, publishing, all of it. He had trained as a lawyer, said Badinter, though he had never worked in the profession. The uncle, on coming back from Europe, decided he would acquire the appropriate licenses and certifications needed to open a small law office or take a job as a civil servant for the municipal government. He was fairly well known in literary circles, though not at all famous, and he had always been affectionate with his nephew. One day, Glusman went to his uncle's house for lunch, says Badinter. After dessert, they sat on the balcony, smoking and drinking coffee, and the uncle, the elder Samuel Glusman, asked our Glusman if he would like to be his literary executor. But you're not dead yet, Glusman told his uncle, says Badinter. I don't mean when I'm dead, said the uncle, and I don't even mean that you have to do anything to manage my manuscripts or estate, says Badinter, quoting Glusman. All I mean, said the uncle, is that maybe as a literary project, you might find it useful to pretend to be me. You don't have to use my name, though that's exactly what he ended up doing. You don't have to acknowledge my work, but if you ever feel like continuing, rewriting, adapting, subverting, or translating any of my books, then I not only give you permission to do this, but I would love to see what you come up with. The uncle, said Glusman to Badinter, did not intend this gesture as an act of self-importance or because he thought Glusman might be unable to create his own work. The uncle said that when he was Glusman's age, just starting to write, an older poet, perhaps also named Samuel Glusman, had done something similar for him, and that somebody had done something similar for that well-known poet before him. He asked simply if Glusman might want to continue this chain of poets inheriting each other's identities. I had no idea how to respond to my uncle's offer, Glusman told Badinter. I didn't take it seriously, and then I forgot all about it for a good 15 years or so until about 1975 or 1976. I was at the most difficult point of my life, says Badinter, quoting Glusman. I left Chile and was trying to figure out what to do with myself. I'd spent a few years first in Venezuela and then Mexico City, where a cousin was living. I had a few prospects. I hadn't gotten together yet with my wife, and I had no idea how I was going to get out of my depression and poverty. I wasn't writing very much either, Glusman told Badinter. I didn't really see the point. Then, Glusman told Badinter, I remembered my uncle's offer to take on his literary identity, and at that point something changed. I won't say that everything got better, but I will say that I began to write again and to perhaps write in such a way that I could leave the dungeon of my own miserable mind. To make a long story short, Badinter says to the translator, although at this point they both realized this was never going to be a short story. Abraham Dahlberg told me about how he became Samuel Glusman, and he asked if I would do him a favor. He said he had no interest in making grandiose declarations about his literary estate, a phrase Glusman found preposterous. He didn't have much of an estate to manage. There were a handful of books that were mostly out of print. There were decades worth of notebooks, which, said Glusman to Badinter, no one in their right mind would read. There are some unfinished things, a memoir, a novel, a few books of poems. And then he handed me a thumb drive, says Badinter. If ever you are struck by the urge to read them, change them, publish them, you have my blessing. But you barely know me, said Badinter. I barely know anyone, said Glusman. Badinter took the thumb drive and threw it in her bag. She and Glusman sat in silence until a nurse came in with a tray of food for lunch. Badinter said goodbye to Glusman. She didn't know if she should hug him or kiss him on the cheek or even shake his hand. She simply stood up and gave him an awkward wave. I have to go now, she said. And that was the last time I saw him. So this process of taking a failed novel and turning it into a 4-page poem that later became a series of short stories is not something that I had done before, and certainly not something I could intentionally replicate. But it perhaps represents many of the things that I've been trying to talk about today. One, the endless act of translation, that it's both a conceptual method and a generative process. Two, translation as subject matter. And in the case of the poem and story, writers who are mistranslating, who are plagiarizing, and who imagine literature as nothing more than an endless game of translation and transcreation. Three, translation as poetic theory. And four, intertextual translation of my own work through multiple genres as a means of extending my own project and making me, at the very least, be able to imagine that my writings are not separate, but rather that they are one long unified book. The book of trying to write a life, which includes a life filled with bad poems. Because as the French critic and poet Marina Badinter says in the short story, The Translators, the history of poetry is also the history of bad poetry. And so you are always justified in publishing your worst poems under whatever damn name you please. I'll stop there. Thank you. Professor Coviello.
Daniel, thank you so much for that wonderful reading. I wonder if you could talk some about one of what I find to be one of the most elemental parts of your work, which is its humor. That is to say, your poems are incendiary and apocalyptic, and at moments brutal, but I have trouble thinking of many other poets who are as continuously funny in ways that recall Ginsberg or Ashberg or a number of other people. And I wonder what you think about it, or what humor is for you conceptually, because it's a thing you do so well.
Thank you. I mean, I don't think that anything I write is actually funny. And I think maybe that is like the only way you can write something funny, perhaps, because if you're like actually trying to make jokes, there's, I don't know, that is much more difficult. And I guess humor, comes from like the juxtaposition of things that don't go together. And where I think it happens, and again, I don't know that I'm like the person to ask about my own work, but I'll try, is that there's often like, when I'm happiest writing poems, there's like 6 or 7 narratives in them at the same time, and the narratives might have developed as I was talking about here, like over several different years and in different contexts, and I think it is like that clashing of things that weren't actually meant to be put together, which I think produces what you are calling humor. But again, I think like the intent, I don't know how comedians do it. Like that seems like a really hard thing to try to write jokes and then to like have the expectation that people are going to laugh at a certain time, and that seems much more challenging. And I think if you're sort of self-important about it. I don't know. I don't know if I don't know if other poets sort of take humor on as a thing like I'm going to be funny. But my suspicion is when you do that, it doesn't work. But I don't know. So that's a start.
Thanks, Daniel. I really enjoyed that. I have a question about this side note that you have. It's Kafka's The Penal Colony.
Oh, yeah.
And you cite and say a gag which for many decades I have been obsessed with.
Uh-huh.
It's so suggestive. I mean, the condemned prisoner is having language stenciled onto his back. And you're obsessed with the gag.
Yeah, because in the story, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, there's a European traveler who comes to the penal colony to observe an execution, and the executioner, the person in charge of the machine, is really upset because the machine is really old and keeps malfunctioning. And among the many malfunctions is that they only have this one gag, and that the people who are condemned are condemned to go be in the machine which writes the. I guess it's not an execution. They have their sentence carved into their back. The impresario of the machine is really upset about the gag, which seems like a really funny thing to be upset about, given the gravity of everything else that is happening about with the machine. And so it seems to me like that moment of silencing the person who is about to be condemned, and about to be condemned through writing, right? Because the machine, like the harrow it's called, writes his sentence on his back, right? He wants to make sure not only that, I suppose like technically he wants to make sure he doesn't bite his tongue, right? But he also wants to make sure that he doesn't speak or scream. But he also wants to make sure that there's some kind of originality to that like moment of being silent and not speaking and not screaming. And so that always seems like a really funny detail to me. And it's a very small one in the story. You're right, like it's not something one notices. But I've thought about it for ever and like wondered why there's so much sort of focusing, why that moment is there. And for me, there's something about the like mixed messaging around silencing, around a kind of dignity of giving this person a clean gag, and of the sort of mixture of those things happening at the time that writing is the sentence that is going to be put onto his back. I don't know. Yeah, no.
Thank you. Gracias, Daniel. I was wondering, I mean, what your work also brought to mind, obviously, Bolaño's Savage Detectives, and Chile by Night, no?
Mm-hmm.
Chile de Noche.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about the one word that was up in the title of hemispheric, and how you locate your own voice within that context of displaced writers who go back, and how do you locate yourself?
Good question. I think what has interested me, and there's sort of been like several steps along the way, but one of the early ones, towards the beginning, Dean Freeman mentioned that I had been an editor at a journal called Mandorla, which no longer exists, but Mandorla was called Mandorla, New Writings of the Americas, Nueva Escrituras de las Americas, edited by Kristen Dijkstra and Roberto Tejada. And one of the things that Mandorla did, and it brought together a kind of team of writers, some of whom were at a very young age, and I think gave us a certain kind of like multilingual writing community. But one of the things that journal did was it published work in translation from Spanish to English, or from English to Spanish, or from other languages of the Americas. It would sometimes publish just work in Spanish. It would sometimes publish just work in English, and it sort of created this platform by which, to not only not separate it, right, but to like not explain the separation, and to create, and I think there was something like 16 issues. They were hundreds and hundreds of pages long, like 600 some pages, and to create this environment where being multilingual, at least in this very kind of small space, was normal. And so I think that for me was really important. It also kind of sort of introduced me to writers who were writing multilingually and kind of thinking about language, their own sort of mixed identities, and wanting to write without sort of having to kind of justify the movements between languages or places. So Mónica de la Torre, the translator of Juan Luis Martinez, Ura Juan Noel, Puerto Rican writer, we were all kind of brought on to be a part of the editorial team. And so for me, this was this really kind of valuable and important moment where I was introduced to this community of other people who were thinking and writing multilingually, and it gave me a certain kind of permission. I think another way of answering it, too, has to do with translation, because I started translating and writing very young, seriously, at a young age, and I was sort of doing both of them together, and I didn't know how to do either. The kind of both like bravery and stupidity and courage of not knowing what you're doing, and to sort of do those two things together also was a really foundational for me, and I've always sort of tried to keep those two things happening at the same time as a way of kind of imagining a unified project between them. So I think that is a start to how I would answer the question. But I think part of it, and maybe to go back to Mandorla too, is this sort of interest in both Latinx writing and from the U.S. and Latin American writing, and putting them together. And that was also a kind of model for how to think about that and how to kind of make a writing life out of that.
It is a thought or maybe a question.
Sure.
I don't know. Badinter says translation, she says, is nothing more than the creation of infinite originals.
Uh-huh.
And my question is like, how do you experiment these kind of creative momentum? How do you live this kind of, how do you perceive these infinite originals in the way that you translate things and with this polyphonic, multilingual state of being, right?
That is sort of ripping off the title of Karen Emmerich, translation scholar, translator and translation studies scholar Karen Emmerich's book called Translation and the Creation of Originals. Is that what it is? Something like that. And her kind of argument in this book is that throughout history, we tend to think of like the original and the translation, right? And the original has primacy, right? And the translation is a different thing, but throughout history, and she gives kind of various examples and theorizes them of times where the translation actually creates, in a certain sense, creates a new original, or has changed the text so dramatically, either through kind of publishing conventions or linguistic conventions. Like, for example, publishers might say to a translator, "Oh, that's great. You want to translate a 450-page novel, but you have to make it 300 pages." Right? So that is a new book, right? And so she kind of historicizes this process by which translation keeps kind of recreating the original. And then I think sometimes there's also examples of, especially when translating into lesser spoken languages, there would often be it would often be important for a writer to get their book translated into English, because that meant, let's say, a writer from, Czech. They get their book translated into English, and that, well, Czech's a bad example. Let's say Portuguese. And they get it translated into English, and that might allow for somebody like in Estonia to translate their work, but they're going to translate it from the English, right? And so there is this sort of constant circulation of what the actual original is that becomes really hard to recognize after a while.
Daniel, a very quick question,
Sure.
which may not be a very coherent one, but it seems to me that what struck me in the presentation is that there were these images of decapitations and executions were kind of popping up kind of casually. There was a poem, Zurita's poem, about Garcilaso's poem about the decapitation of Tupac Amaru. Then there is this floating decapitated head of a Cheshire cat. Then there was the penal colony. So I wanted to ask you about this presence or importance of violence, and more than violence, brutality in your poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And the brutality on both levels, the language of the level of poetic language, because there is something brutal about how other poems, how the translation kind of takes over the process of writing poetry and just explodes it, right? There's an element of this kind of brutality, just running with it and seeing where it goes. So, and also at the level of history, right? Because there are all these, there's something brutal in the Speedy Gonzalez thing you showed us. So just about, this category of brutality in poetry and in history.
I mean, I suspect, thank you for the question. I suspect that when that book review is sort of citing me for being a bad writer, that is actually part of it, is that like objection to, and maybe I'm giving the reviewer more credit than they deserve, but objection to the idea that a sort of casual treatment of violence is like worthy of poetic content, right? And I guess my reaction, and you sort of pointed it out, like I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about the Speedy Gonzalez, just to sort of start there, right, is that like all of those, that sort of genre of cartoon is all about the incorporation of really brutal violence into humor, and to make it palatable for children, right? And like movement and speed, right? So like the very violent moment has no repercussions, right? Like this, he blows himself up, but he looks normal. The cat blows himself up, but looks perfectly normal 1 second later, right? And if I have anything interesting to say, I think it's that like the ideas that have been kind of with me is that we are inundated, not even with violence, but with like imagery of violence, right? And that, we in the U.S. Are inundated with both violence and imagery of violence, right? But it is also like so much a part of our daily lives that it is like almost I don't know, that there's nothing unique or special about it, right? It is just like how we decide to process it, right? And I think what I've been kind of trying to do in my writing is not so much to write about violence, but to like write about how we see violence, and to write about like how we look at it, because it feels to me like that's a more interesting thing to do, that writing like the actual violence is unbearable, but like writing the way that we consume violence and the way we perceive violence and then the way we sort of process it and quickly move on from it or like incorporate it into our lives is more interesting to me. And then I think maybe to sort of go back to like the Chilean examples you mentioned, Zurita, Juan Luis Martinez, right? They're living in these moments of dictatorship where there's no escaping it, right? And there's no escaping the idea that like your neighbor wants to kill you. And it very well might be like the person next door to you, right? But you also have to find a way to live with them and to work with them, and I feel like that sort of that is animating their writing at the same time, is that like that you want to live lives full of I don't know, love and joy and happiness, but at the same time there's this totally brutal backdrop that you cannot hide from. And so I think that's, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how I've been interested in it. Sure. Mm-hmm.